If you work in Linux, DevOps, or general infrastructure, I think 2026 is becoming one of those years where you cannot afford to ignore licensing news anymore. Because this is no longer just an argument between lawyers or a niche community flame war on a mailing list. This is starting to affect the tools people actually deploy, automate, support, and build businesses around. Over the last months, we have seen multiple open source projects hit some kind of breaking point. LibreOffice is in the middle of a governance crisis, with the Document Foundation removing membership from a large group of Collabora-linked contributors. LibreOffice has launched into an immediate licensing confrontation over AGPL compliance. HashiCorp's long-running Terraform relicensing fallout is still hanging over OpenTofu. And Redis has gone through such a messy licensing journey that a lot of admins are still asking a very basic question. What exactly counts as Redis now, and is it really open source again? What makes this different is that all of these stories are happening at roughly the same time. So when you step back and look at the pattern, it does not feel like a one-off drama around one angry maintainer or one company making a bad PR decision. It feels more like the rules of the open source relationship are being renegotiated in public. And that matters because for years, most of us made a fairly simple assumption. If a project was popular, widely packaged, and had a big community behind it, then it was probably safe enough to build on. Maybe not perfect, maybe not eternal, but stable enough. In 2026, that assumption looks a lot weaker. So in this video, I want to break this down in a practical way. First, what actually happened with LibreOffice and why the backlash has been so strong. Then the EuroOffice dispute and why AGPL arguments are suddenly back in the spotlight. After that, the Terraform versus OpenTofu situation, because this is still one of the most important infrastructure licensing stories for anyone in automation or cloud. Then Redis, because that project has become a case study in how fast trust can be damaged and how hard it is to rebuild. And finally, I want to answer the question that really matters for this channel. As a sysadmin platform engineer or self-hosting enthusiast, which of these fights should you actually worry about? And where are the safer alternatives if you want predictable governance and less legal noise? Because that, to me, is the real story here. Open source is not disappearing. But the old social contract, where companies, foundations, maintainers, and users all more or less pulled in the same direction, is under a lot more strain than it used to be. Let's start with LibreOffice, because that story is messy, emotional, and depending on who you ask, either a necessary cleanup or one of the most self-destructive moves an open source foundation has made in years. So let's talk about LibreOffice, because this is the one that really caught a lot of people off guard. The headline version is simple. The Document Foundation, or TDF, removed membership from a large group of people connected to Collabora, including longtime contributors and some extremely significant names in LibreOffice history. That is why so many people reacted by saying, hold on, did they just eject some of the project's core developers? Now, TDF's defense is important here, because if you only read the angry post, the story sounds like a random purge. TDF says this has been building for years, and that the real issue is not code contribution, but governance and nonprofit compliance. According to TDF, past arrangements around branding and development contracts created conflicts of interest that were not compatible with the legal obligations of a nonprofit foundation. They say legal counsel raised concerns, audits followed, and the board eventually had to act to reduce that risk. In TDF's own framing, this was a governance correction. They point to updated conflict of interest rules, new community bylaws, and restrictions meant to break a deadlock that had apparently been dragging on for years. They even argue that failing to deal with this could have put the foundation's nonprofit status at risk. But then you look at the other side and you can immediately understand why the reaction has been so hostile. Collabora says this was effectively a mass ejection of more than 30 people who have contributed heavily to LibreOffice for years, including major historical committers and some founders. And from that perspective, it looks less like a governance cleanup and more like the foundation cutting itself off from a huge chunk of its own engineering depth. That is why this story hit such a nerve. In open source, legitimacy does not come only from legal structure. It also comes from trust, contributor history, technical merit, and whether the community believes governance is being used to protect the project rather than to win a political fight. And this is where sysadmins should pay attention. Because if you deploy LibreOffice or depend on the broader ecosystem around it, the immediate question is not whether LibreOffice stops existing tomorrow. It won't. The real question is whether long-term development, maintenance, and collaboration get harder when a project's institutional center and a big part of its experienced contributor base are openly at war. To be clear, this is not a story about LibreOffice suddenly becoming unusable. It is a story about governance, confidence, and in infrastructure and productivity tooling, confidence matters. If you are rolling out a platform across a company, you want to know not just that the code works today, but that the people around it are still capable of working together next year. And that brings us to the next part of this wider crisis. Because LibreOffice shows what happens when the argument moves from governance into licensing itself. And once AGPL enters the room, things get very technical very quickly. Now let's move from governance to licensing, not because the LibreOffice story is a perfect example of how messy open source gets when everyone agrees the code is available, but not everyone agrees on the conditions. LibreOffice was launched by European partners, including Nextcloud and Ionos, as a sovereignty-focused office suite, basically positioned as a European alternative for collaborative document editing. On paper, that taps directly into a very strong narrative right now. Digital sovereignty, local control, reduced dependence on American cloud platforms, all of that. But almost immediately, OnlyOffice pushed back and said, not so fast. Their claim is that LibreOffice is using technology derived from OnlyOffice in violation of the applicable licensing terms. And the key point here is not just standard AGPL reciprocity. OnlyOffice argues that under Section 7 of AGPL v3, it can impose additional conditions, including preserving branding, logo, and attribution requirements. LibreOffice, or at least reporting around the dispute, pushes in the opposite direction. The argument there is that some of these extra conditions may go beyond what AGPL is supposed to allow, especially if they behave like additional restrictions instead of acceptable notices or attribution terms. This is where a lot of people get confused because they hear AGPL and think the answer should be simple. It isn't. AGPL is already one of the more demanding licenses for network software because it extends source sharing obligations to software provided as a service. Then you add Section 7 language, trademark issues, attribution demands, product identity concerns, and suddenly you are no longer in the comfortable world of just publish the source and you're done. What matters for this video is that based on the sources I checked, this looks like a public legal and licensing confrontation, not a clearly confirmed filed court case at that stage. So the accurate framing is not, LibreOffice has definitely lost in court. The accurate framing is that this launch immediately triggered a serious compliance dispute over what AGPL plus additional terms actually means in practice. And honestly, this is why a lot of admins hate licensing ambiguity. Not because licensing is so important, but because ambiguity turns infrastructure choices into legal interpretation contests. If you are a company adopting a platform, you do not want to discover 6 months later that the vendor, the fork, and the original project all disagree on whether your deployment model is clean. The bigger issue is trust again. Once a project says, yes, the code is open, but there are these extra conditions, and someone else says those conditions are not enforceable, users are stuck in the middle, but that is bad enough for Office software. In infrastructure, it gets worse. And that takes us directly to HashiCorp and OpenTofu, where the relicensing fight hit one of the most important tools in modern ops. If you are in DevOps, platform engineering, or cloud automation, this is probably the licensing story that hits closest to home. Back in 2023, HashiCorp changed Terraform from the MPL 2.0 license to the business source license, or BSL. That move triggered a huge reaction because Terraform was not some niche side project. it was foundational tooling for infrastructure as code across a massive part of the industry. Very quickly, OpenTofu emerged under the Linux Foundation as a community fork based on the last MPL license Terraform codebase. That alone would already make this one of the defining open source stories of the decade. But the tension did not stop at the fork. In April 2024, OpenTofu said it received a cease and desist letter from HashiCorp over the implementation of the removed block, with HashiCorp alleging copyright infringement. OpenTofu rejected the claim and said the code in question could be traced back to older MPL license material. Now, this distinction matters. A cease and desist is not the same thing as a final court ruling, and it is not automatically the same thing as a filed lawsuit. But for users, it still sends a very clear message. The split is not just philosophical, it is adversarial. And then, of course, the IBM angle hangs over everything because IBM moved to acquire HashiCorp in a deal that changed how many people interpret the company's strategy. Even when IBM is not the direct name on every legal letter, the market reads the whole situation differently once a major enterprise giant is involved. The story stops looking like one vendor protecting its IP and starts looking like another example of strategic consolidation around formerly open infrastructure. From a sysadmin point of view, the practical question is pretty simple. Can you still standardize on Terraform and feel good about the long-term licensing direction? Or do you move toward OpenTofu? Because governance and licensing predictability matter more than brand familiarity. For a lot of teams, OpenTofu has become attractive for exactly that reason. It represents a familiar workflow, broad compatibility, and a governance model that feels more aligned with what people expected Terraform to remain. On the other hand, some enterprises are still deeply invested in HashiCorp tooling, commercial support, and surrounding workflows. So a clean break is not always realistic. What changed, though, is the default assumption. Before the release sensing, Terraform was simply infrastructure code tooling. After the release sensing and the legal pressure around the fork, every serious team now has to evaluate it as both a technical dependency and a governance risk. And that, to me, is the key lesson. The moment your infrastructure tool becomes the center of a licensing fight, neutrality is gone. You may not want to pick a side, but eventually your procurement process, your legal team, or your platform roadmap will pick one for you. If Terraform shows what happens when a company relicens a critical tool, Redis shows what happens when a company tries multiple licensing resets in a very short period and then has to win trust back all over again. Redis is a really interesting case because depending on when you stopped paying attention, you can come away with completely different impressions of what happened. For years, Redis was one of those classic infrastructure components. People almost treated like plumbing. It was everywhere. Caches, queues, rate limiting, session storage, transient data, background jobs. If you touched modern web infrastructure, Redis was probably somewhere in the stack. Then came the licensing turbulence. In March 2024, Redis moved away from its earlier open source model and adopted SSPL licensing, a move the company framed as protection against hyperscalers capturing value without giving enough back. That did solve one business problem for Redis, at least from the company's perspective, but it created another one immediately. A lot of the community no longer saw Redis as properly open source in the traditional OSI approved sense. That backlash mattered because open source is not just about whether source code is visible. For many users, it is also about whether the license remains predictable, interoperable, and aligned with long-standing norms around reuse and redistribution. Then, in 2025, Redis changed course again. With Redis 8, the company officially announced that AGPL v3 would be added as an OSI-approved licensing option. So if you ask, is Redis open source in 2026? The honest answer is yes, but with an asterisk. Redis 8 does include an open source AGPL option. At the same time, the project went through a disruptive sequence of licensing changes, and that sequence changed how a lot of people evaluate its governance and long-term reliability. And this is where the damage is hard to quantify. Once users start asking whether they need a fork, whether packaging will change, whether vendors will switch, or whether a drop-in replacement is safer, some of that trust never fully comes back. Even if the company later moves closer to the community again, the memory of instability remains. This is also why alternatives matter. In the Redis ecosystem, Valky became the most obvious symbol of community and vendor reaction to the licensing shift. And that creates a new kind of pressure. Now, Redis is not just competing on features. It is competing on trust, momentum, and whether users believe the licensing direction will stay stable this time. For sysadmins, the practical takeaway is not that Redis suddenly became bad software. It didn't. The takeaway is that licensing volatility around a core service can force architectural decisions you never wanted to make. When something is part of your base platform, you do not want to debate legal philosophy every time you plan an upgrade. So if you zoom out, Redis tells us something important. A company can absolutely decide that its old open source strategy no longer fits the business. But the second it does that, users start reassessing whether the product is still infrastructure or whether it has become a dependency with a moving legal target. And when you combine that with LibreOffice, EuroOffice, and OpenTofu, a broader picture starts to emerge. So let's close this out with the real question. Is corporate open source dying, and what should admins actually do about it? So, is corporate open source dying? I don't think that is the right conclusion. What is dying, or at least weakening, is the old assumption that open source automatically means aligned incentives. For a long time, users benefited from a kind of uneasy balance. Communities got broad adoption. Companies got brand value, support revenue, and ecosystem reach. Cloud vendors got services they could package. Foundations got legitimacy from acting as neutral stewards. It was never perfect, but it was stable enough that most sysadmins could ignore the politics and just deploy the software. Now that balance is cracking. Some foundations are becoming more aggressive about governance and compliance. Some vendors are trying to protect revenue with source available terms, additional license conditions, or tighter control over branding and redistribution. And communities, when they feel trust is broken, are becoming much more willing to fork early and build parallel institutions instead of waiting for reconciliation. That means the decision matrix has changed. When you evaluate a tool in 2026, you are not just asking, is it fast, stable, and well documented? You are also asking who controls it, how predictable is the license, how independent is the governance, and how painful would a forced migration be if the relationship goes bad. For the stories we covered today, my practical view is this. LibreOffice is still usable, but the governance conflict is serious enough that I would watch community cohesion very closely. EuroOffice is interesting, especially if digital sovereignty matters to your organization, but I would not treat it as low risk until the licensing position is much clearer. With Terraform and OpenTofu, I think many teams should at least be testing OpenTofu now, even if they are not ready to migrate immediately, because having an exit path matters. And with Redis, I would look very carefully at versioning, license terms, and ecosystem alternatives like Valky before locking in long-term platform decisions. The common thread is simple. Do not outsource your strategic thinking to brand familiarity. A popular project can still become a governance problem. A technically excellent tool can still become a licensing risk. And a well-known company can still make decisions that no longer match what the community thought the deal was. So for sysadmins, the safest path is boring but effective. Track governance, read license change announcements, prefer projects with transparent stewardship, keep migration options alive, and avoid building your entire platform around a single vendor controlled interpretation of openness. Because the real fork war is not just about code, it is about trust. Who earns it, who burns it, and what happens to users when that trust collapses. If you've been following any of these stories in your own environment, or if your company has already had to rethink tools because of licensing, let me know in the comments. Ajao, I'm genuinely curious where people are drawing the line now, because I have a feeling this conversation is only getting started. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.